Good afternoon and welcome to our session today for the National Council on Public History 2021 meeting. We're gathered here today to talk about what has been 2 full decades of online collecting, the process of building digital collections on the web. And so we might think that in 2021, the major thing that we might be grappling with as a country and a culture is thinking about the dramatic trauma of the COVID epidemic. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. But for those of us who have been in the business of working on digital archives, there is another anniversary that we come to here in 2021, and that is the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. And the September 11th attacks in the National Capital area and in Pennsylvania and in New York were the impetus for the beginning of really the first large-scale venture to collect evidence of an important historical event directly from the public using the web, right on the cusp of the beginning of the 21st century. And so this notion of active collecting and co-creation and shared authority that is so deep and rich in the work of public history is imbued across all of these collections. And so today we're going to take the opportunity to hear from people who are part of the leadership structure for many, many, many of these collections. And so I'm going to share my screen here for a moment. We're going to get to Omeka in a moment. But as I mentioned, the September 11th digital archive is one of those primary collections, which was started at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media shortly after that attack, and led to, in many structural ways, the infrastructure that became Omeka and Omeka S in later years. We're also going to hear from a project director for the Hurricane Digital Memory Bank. We'll hear from me a little bit about the Bracero History Archive. We'll hear about Antioch A.M.E. history and that digital collection, and the Journal of the Plague Year, which is a collection about our contemporary situation with the COVID pandemic. And so we're joined today by Tom Scheinfeldt, Sheila Brennan, Shanee Murrain, and Catherine O'Donnell. And so we're going to proceed for the next hour to have a conversation amongst ourselves about these projects and these histories. And what we want to do today is start with a conversation about how each of us got into the work of building digital collections. So a little bit about our personal history and our connections to our projects and the kind of perspectives we might bring to things today. We're going to start with Tom.
Thanks, Sharon. I'm going to start off with one of the first questions we posed in our proposal in talking about the September 11th Digital Archive and how I came to that project and the circumstances of the foundation of that project and how that shaped my career, my thinking about historical work, and my thinking about the digital history. So I came to the September 11th Digital Archive in early 2002. The project was launched by colleagues at the Center for History and New Media at George Mason University, as Sharon mentioned, and partners at the American Social History Project at the City University of New York Grad Center. In the days immediately following the attacks, it came out of some earlier experimentation that was funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to collect materials related to the history of science and technology in the late 20th century. The Sloan Foundation had been funding traditional oral history for, as long as they had been in existence, oral histories of scientists and engineers. And they increasingly were concerned that with the sort of exponential growth of American science and technology during the late 20th century, that traditional oral history methods wouldn't scale accordingly as science and engineering became ever more important and present pursuits in our society. So they funded a set of experiments to think about how you might use the internet, which was, relatively young at that time, and other digital technologies to do some of the work that traditional oral history did, but at much larger scale. And so there were a few smaller experiments run by colleagues at the Center for History New Media, Dan Cohen, Roy Rosenzweig, and others. And those had sort of, mixed success, as experiments do. But when the 9/11 attacks occurred in 2001, Sloan, being a New York foundation, reached out to its existing grantees to ask whether they had interventions that that Sloan could fund quickly, sort of just taking a whole bunch of money and tossing it at projects that related to the attack. And our sort of very, very small, because most of those projects were engineering projects and other things, but our very, very small piece of that was a historical project that ultimately became the September 11th Digital Archive. Those colleagues started collecting in September of 2001, launched the website, the collection portal, in December 2001, and began collecting what they thought would probably be 3 categories of materials. Stories, so firsthand narratives, which would be typed into a box on the web page. Image uploads, and recall this was the sort of beginning of digital photography, where people started carrying these digital cameras, not phones at the time, digital cameras with lots and lots of storage and easy connections to computers and therefore to the web. So they anticipated they would collect images, and then they thought they might also collect emails, right? Emails that people sent back and forth in the aftermath of the web. It turned out that the internet being kind of the free-for-all that it is, through that image upload button, they ended up collecting very quickly lots and lots of other things, Word documents, PDFs. Now we would know better to limit it by file type, but at the time that wasn't really something we thought about. Flash, little video games built in Flash. Really anything that could be created on a computer started coming into this portal. I came on in early 2002 as a doctoral student. I was ABD. I was finishing up my DPhil at the University of Oxford, and I had finished all the research, and I was writing up in Washington, D.C. while my wife was at law school. And so, we had an agreement. She came with me to Oxford to do my degree. When I had finished the necessary research in the libraries there, I came back to the States for her to go to law school. We were very young. I was sitting in my kitchen, writing my dissertation, and feeling extremely lonely. And this job ad came across my transom for a public historian who knew HTML, basically. I had spent time as a public historian, both in my graduate work and prior to that at the Colorado Historical Society. I knew HTML mainly from working the help desk as a graduate student, and so these were early days. And so I fit the bill for this, what was structured as kind of a postdoc, but I was actually pre-doc, and I jumped into that job while I was writing my dissertation. That was grant-funded work, and it was a 2-year grant, and they were already 6 months into it. So I knew that I would have 18 months of employment out of this, and not much more. But there was always the both implicit and explicit advice to me that if we could raise more money, I could stay in this job. And so that set me on a career of successive, there was probably 10 years, successive short-term term appointments as a public historian working at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media.
That's a perfect place to transition, Tom. Thanks for that. We're going to move, I think, probably onto Sheila since she's chronologically next. We should also say that Tom didn't actually introduce himself. He's at the University of Connecticut. Yes. I also didn't introduce myself. My name's Sharon Leon, and I'm at Michigan State University, and on we go.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Sheila Brennan, and I am here today as an independent public historian and reuniting with some of my former colleagues at the center. In fact, Tom hired me to be the project manager for what was becoming the Hurricane Digital Memory Bank. It was colleagues based on the success and the reputation that Roy and Dan and Tom and the folks at CUNY had developed with the September 11th Digital Archive prompted a public historian at the University of New Orleans, Michael Nelson, to contact Roy and ask in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, which was, at this point it was early September of 2005, if there was a possibility to do a similar kind of project. And so I got a call from Tom. I was packing up the apartment I was living in. I happened to be geographically relevant. I think that's an important piece of this project. Yeah, maybe I had some experience, but I also happened to be living on the Gulf Coast in 2005. And I think this is one of those things we find over and over again, as Tom was talking about, sort of where your personal circumstances are in life kind of sometimes lead you into taking roles and projects that you might not have predicted. So I had a background in museum work, and I had recently left my job as a director of education and public programs at the US Navy Museum. And for personal reasons, I happened to be down in Port Arthur, Texas. I also happened to be a graduate student in GMU's history program and was one of Roy's advisees and minoring in history and new media. So I was at this sort of turning point where I wasn't sure what was coming next, but I was still sort of looking for work. And this kind of project, which was grant funded by the Sloan Foundation, again, while it wasn't permanent, it was perfect for where I was. And I was also really pleased to be asked to do this kind of meaningful response work because, that was something a little bit new to me. And I will, and it also kind of opened up some other possibilities for me later in my life. Again, even though I wasn't permanent staff, it was one of those things where I was starting to learn about what it meant to work for an academic institution and what my professional place at that moment meant. For this project, I was essentially a graduate student project manager. And for some of the collaborators, that put me much far down the academic hierarchy, whereas I had just left a job as being the department director at a federal museum. And so it was a little bit of a transition for me. And it certainly didn't come from Roy or Tom or any of my colleagues at the center, but it just sort of, reminded me like, oh, I'm like now operating in this very different world. But one of the things, some of the things that I brought with me from my past position, my museum position, was that I had project management skills. I was familiar with shaping outreach plans and audiences and how to connect with, fellow museum professionals. And I knew a little bit about audiences and while I hadn't, and it wasn't really defined like this before, this user-centered design, something that I was very familiar with, and that would become very much part of the work that I began to do. I was not well versed in archival management or library sciences or complex database design, but I knew how to build a website. I knew a little bit about web design. So I was very lucky that, much like Tom, I was able to kind of stay in this position, and sort of as grants and projects grew, was able to be part of those teams. And it was through working on Hurricane Digital Memory Bank that I saw just a space for doing public history, where historians could respond to a traumatic event by documenting experiences. There were opportunities to teach others how to do the same so that they could then document their own communities and stories, and wouldn't always have to be centered around trauma or tragedy. And also, this was a big step because I then became part of this larger project, which Sharon mentioned, the software publishing platform called Omeka. So some of the work that we were doing, even though September 11th Digital Archive was not built in it, HGMB was sort of the precursor to what would become Omeka. So all of this sort of brought together my interest in media and digital history, but also centering sort of a public history approach.
That might be a good time to talk about the birth of Omeka, which Sheila and Tom were certainly central to. And, there's a long origin story for Omeka that is told over and over again. And that is that at the Center for History and New Media, we kept being asked to participate in collaborations that required a similar sort of set of facilities. And many of those projects were focused on this notion of how can we build more public engagement into the digital sphere. We're thinking about a world in which we're transitioning from a web 1.0 to a web 2.0. And Omeka really was sort of the fruit of all of those earlier collaborations and lessons learned. And so not unlike Tom and Sheila talking about, learning how all of this might work on the job, I also learned to be a public historian on the job. And we learned how to build software to facilitate public history work on the job through the fruits of these kinds of collaborations. And the original Omeka funding was through an Institute for Museum and Library Services National Leadership Grant. And we really took that spirit of that call to heart, is that what we wanted to build in Omeka was to build something that would facilitate work for other people. And at just about the same time as Omeka was getting funded and starting to be really built as a going concern that other people could use, could figure out how to use, and would have the kinds of extensions and collecting modules that it has today in a variety of forms. We also, Tom and I worked together on a proposal to the National Endowment for the Humanities to fund a distributed collecting project about the history of Bracero guest workers. And that project is absolutely a collection of oral histories and images, and is the result of community meetings, scanning days, and things like that. It eventually had an online collecting component, but it was a very, very small part of it. But it allowed us to test something about Omeka, which was, could this piece of software be a central point for a distributed network of scholars and community groups to collaborate on building a collection together in a way that they would never be able to do in isolated ways, or not as effectively in isolated ways. And so some of the learning about how the infrastructure could work also happened through this collecting project that produced a digital collection, but was not a collection mostly of born digital materials. And so I've sort of been on the infrastructure side since then. And it's an infrastructure I think that turns out is at play in the rest of the projects here. So, Shanee, I know you come to this with like, you're our only person with a library degree. And so, we have spent years and years learning from you and your colleagues. So I wonder if you'll talk to us about the Antioch project and your connection to it.
I will. I came to libraries and building digital collections from the user perspective, in that I had a question about the availability and accessibility of records related to the history of African American churches. It was during my final year of a graduate program in religious studies in 2011 that I was introduced to librarianship and archives by the theological librarian who recommended I pursue the MLS degree to build a comprehensive digital archive of Black history, which was what we were searching for. And that formative experience of not finding what I expected to find guides my user-centric approach to building digital collections with community archives in churches such as the Antioch Church in Stone Mountain. The Antioch A.M.E. Digital History Project is a community-generated repository of artifacts, images, oral histories, and documents that trace the history of the church in concert with this 150th year celebration in 2018. And due to my unique subject specialty in having a Master's of Divinity and also having that practical archives experience, I was brought onto the project as part of my work with the University of West Georgia. And I advised the church members and graduate students in the creation of metadata and the execution of community archives practices. The Antioch A.M.E. project is hosted on Omeka, and it was selected because it met several requirements for use, it being free and open source, it being a user-friendly interface that students and church members could learn and use about. It has the structured metadata schema for archival objects, and it includes features, that allow for that community interaction. The project was funded by the Georgia Humanities, which is the local, state, national endowment for the humanities affiliated organization. And part of the labor of that work was a commitment to doing the work publicly and building on the emerging practices, those archival practices in our field, and making critical assessments about the power dynamics in play in university and community partnerships, and also introducing community members to how libraries and archives build collections and how we do that work. So it was information literacy in both directions. And it's now I didn't start off with this, now I'm at the Digital Public Library of America, where I serve as Director of Community Engagement. Community is still a part of that work that I do, but it's wonderful to be able to reflect on the Antioch A.M.E. Church project and what we learned from embedding that work in the community and prioritizing the community as subject specialists.
That's great. It's a spectacular project. So thank you for that. I'm excited to hear more about it today. Catherine, you?
Yeah, I'm a professor of history at Arizona State University, and I'm an Atlantic world person at home in the 18th century Catholicism. So why am I here? And the answer is just that late one afternoon, early last March, as kind of things were beginning to fall apart, right? Like you could kind of feel it. The NBA was canceling its season and Tom Hanks had COVID all of a sudden. So I wrote to my wonderful colleague, Mark Thibault, who's our director of public history and our director of our school, Richard Amesbury, and I headed it Journal of the Plague Semester. And the email was like, I don't know, is there some way we could create like a time capsule, but like online? And, listening to you, I just have this vision of myself going, I'm imagining kind of a round thing that could go under sort of vehicles and it would, but I had no idea. So Mark immediately emails back, we can do this. and a Zoom link, which we all thought was very funky. And then I walked down to my director's office because we were still in person. And by the time I got to Richard's office, Mark had checked to see whether the domain name was available. He's, calling up the screen to show us what Omeka is. And he immediately said, it's actually a digital archive, Catherine. It's not a time capsule. So that began the project kind of. And that weekend, he and I and my children were enlisted, went around taking pictures, and he put up a very basic site. And then I have had the privilege of having just been promoted to full professor and faculty head. So like it was okay that I thought I can spend some time on this, right? Like, this is not my field. I don't know what I'm doing, but this is actually a good use of the bagginess of a tenured faculty position, right? So I was kind of helpful in connecting us to students, to other colleagues, reassuring them this is not a siloed kind of public history thing. This is a way that we can participate in this moment, actually using our expertise. When it initially seems so much clearer how doctors and scientists and so forth could be of use. It's like, oh, wow, we can be of use as historians, as people who understand archives. But we immediately had graduate students involved. We have an endowment. We're fortunate to have an endowment. And so I wanted to have kind of a WPA quality to it so that whatever else happened, we were getting some money out to graduate students to do some work. So we immediately built that piece in. We have, I guess you'd use the word contingent, fixed term colleagues who also just above and beyond participated, started translating our work, our calls into Spanish. So it was kind of the whole ecosystem of the university, track, contingent, graduate students, undergraduate students. It was the only thing happening initially related to COVID that had to do with the humanities. That changed, but we were early, so our dean gave us money, which we could then put back out into students. And I have just, my official role is like village idiot, or, person who doesn't understand digital humanities or how this works, which is sometimes has been useful because I'll ask questions, right? Or I'll be able to sort of help put this in layperson's terms. But I've also just learned so much about the collaborative nature of public history, about the constant sort of readjustments and recalibrations that occur with community collecting throughout this process. So it's really been a gift. And I always say, the last thing I'll say is I send a lot of odd late afternoon emails and usually nothing, but because you all had created this amazing platform and there was this sort of tradition to build on, this really did become a great project that mainly my colleagues have directed.
That's right. That's great. Thank you. So I'm thinking in listening to these introductions, sort of our next sort of topic of conversation is about project goals and design goals and and the curating and building of these collections and hopefully the effort to not reproduce situations and contexts of inequality and all of those sorts of things. But I'm struck anew listening to everyone about the frequency with which these projects are launched quickly in response to a moving target of a situation, as opposed to, so for September 11th and for the Hurricane Digital Memory Bank and for the Journal of the Plague Year, but for the Bracero History Archive and the Antioch work, there was really some time to really put a planning process into place to think about how those collections might come together in the service, and to some degree, I would think of actively combating those conditions of inequality and representation. And so I wonder if we might as a whole talk a little bit about that planning process and the design goals around those projects. I mean, Catherine, obviously you just said that, that you started with a response to wanting to be involved as a humanist. And then did that lead to a set of planning and design meetings about the kinds of goals and parameters of the project?
Yes, that would be an elegant term to put on our rapid fire Zoom sessions and emails. Absolutely. So the pandemic was everywhere, right? It was not a finite event. In fact, we still struggle with the title Journal of the Plague Year in that it's never been clear what the endpoint was. And so in a non-technical sense, we immediately began to try to craft calls and reach out to people to explain that their experiences of the pandemic mattered, whatever they were. So to try to lower the bar for participation, which people clearly felt, well, I'm not sick, right? Or I'm just sitting here being sad because I can't talk to my grandmother. I'm like, no, that's the thing, right? Tell us how you can't hug your grandmother. So in a non-technical sense, part of it was to sort of broadcast that we're interested in the mundane, in the daily experience and things that are not happening. But also very quickly, and again, these are my colleagues who had thought more clearly about this than I had, the problem of silences in the archives was front and center. Who is not going to participate? And so this might well be communities of color who, of course, were more affected by the pandemic, as we came to learn, right, in terms of mortality rates, but were not readily showing up in the archive. Rural communities, in part because of bandwidth issues, like literal bandwidth issues, but also perhaps alienation from the university, right, which was where this was emanating from. Older people, again, very affected by COVID-19, less likely to participate in digital archives. We're in Arizona, we have large Native American populations who were dramatically affected and quickly affected. I have a colleague, Denise Bates, whose work is with Indigenous peoples, and she was both very adamant that we need to collect and very adamant that we don't get to choose what goes in that archive, right? So, so there was a challenge of leaving people out, but then the challenge of not bringing people in ways that they were unwilling to be brought in with, right? So this is, in short, just something that we have continued to think about constantly and have tried to reach out to all kinds of communities. We have all kinds of partners, but there are still underrepresented people in the archive. And then I'll leave it here, but something distinctive perhaps about the pandemic too is there were and are pandemic deniers, and that is actually a part of the moment. But what does one do with that, right? First of all, how do you attract a pandemic denier into an archive premised on the idea of the pandemic? But secondly, because we were immediately making much of this public, what is our responsibility if people are, in fact, putting in information that could be actually harmful to people? So this is just this rolling, which you all are far more accustomed to than I, this rolling set of questions about how to avoid becoming part of a problem, right, by the way we're archiving, and about how to continually reach out and defer to and learn from all these different communities.
Absolutely. Tom, I wonder, speaking of the oddness of the September 11th collection, if you might want to say, and certainly I assume I want to hear from Shanee about this too.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of what Catherine said resonates with my experience on the 9/11 project. it's been a long time now, but there were and still are 9/11 deniers. And in some ways, in 2001, since the internet was a very different place in 2001, this is pre-social media. This is a time when the internet, the web for most users was a kind of read-only medium. It wasn't people weren't, you went online to like look stuff up, and you went online to, maybe you bought something, you went online to read the newspaper. But you didn't spend a lot of time typing stuff into the web. You didn't spend a lot of time uploading stuff to the web unless you were like a web developer. It was a place to go find information, not provide information. And so in some ways, our, that empty text field gave 9/11 deniers, anti-Islamic racists, and all kinds, a place to say their piece, that the mainstream media, for very good reason, didn't give them that microphone. And it occurs to me now, in listening to this, that in some ways I think that we can trace a lot of the disinformation and misinformation in our current political discourse, and especially over COVID and election fraud and all things, back to that 9/11 moment, when those conspiracy theories, which there are always conspiracy theories, but they were finally given a voice. We thought, that wasn't our intention. Our intention was to give a voice to other underrepresented communities. Our aims were broadly democratic, in that we wanted to, our collection isn't made up mainly of materials from survivors or victims' families, or the heroes of 9/11. It's made up from ordinary people who saw it on TV, and that kind of social experience of the event. And we wanted to get those ordinary voices captured, because we knew that that wasn't the media's role, and it wasn't what they were really going to do. But we also wanted to capture voices that really wouldn't be heard. Muslim communities across the United States, the Chinese American community, who, because of language barriers and socioeconomic barriers, was living in Lower Manhattan in the shadow of the towers, but who, were never interviewed by the nightly news for their experiences. So we saw this digital archive as a way to bring those voices in, but alas, we brought in also a bunch of other voices. And looking back, it's really an interesting hodgepodge of those marginal voices, both marginal because they're crazy, and marginal because they're discriminated against.
Yeah, and Shanee, you had a kind of defined community to work with, unlike the rest of us.
Yeah, it's a bit different how the critical issue of denial came up in the Antioch project. The project began under the initiative of the church members. A church member who's also the church's newsletter author, Tig Murrain, approached Julia Brock at UWG and the Center for Public History about doing an oral history project. And he was thinking and planning out that work 3 years in advance for the church's 150th anniversary. And the issues that we dealt with in the design of the project were those around the legacy and the denial of collections of color being, collected at the same rate as those white narratives. And if the University of West Georgia and Agnes Scott University were the best collaborators to do this kind of work. The project started with a History Day program back in July 2016, and that was twofold: to offer guidance for those church members and to form a history harvest. And then myself and some of the University of West Georgia partners did sessions on preserving documents and photographs. We had a genealogist and a professor talk about the history of the church. So it was a dialogue. We were offering something, and the church members were, sharing their records to be preserved. And that day was a success. However, some members of the church expressed that they were, a bit wary of the project's goals and outcomes, and they had, warranted mistrust about the participation of mostly white UWG graduate students who were handling their materials and recording them. And that, this family that was rooted in the church were worried about whether the university was going to make a profit. So, and there's a history of the exploitation of communities of color by projects like these and institutions like these. So we had to deal with that issue of privilege in our community partnerships, and that affected how we did donor relations, assigning Creative Commons for contributors and the records on the Omeka site, and analyzing our donor documents that sign over copyright of the scans to the University of West Georgia, and discuss with these partners what use and reuse of digital content means, and how we wanted to build the collection to ensure that church members are the ones who are describing the photographs, they're telling the stories, and that they'd have continued control over the website and could take down any of that material as the family or the history of the family later on down the fact deemed that those items didn't need to be online anymore. We also employed, this kind of language of stewardship and the oral history consent forms as well.
Fascinating. Yeah, I would say, as somebody who helped manage the infrastructure for the Bracero project, that project would not have happened at all without similar kinds of really close driven community conversations, on the ground, one-on-one conversations that happened in a face-to-face way before digitization happened or anything like that. And that was essential to building trust with a community who's like, why do you want our stuff? And then on the other end of it, like, oh, the Smithsonian wants our stuff. So kind of both sides of that coin. Sheila, how do you build a collection on a moving train?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, I think that, both Catherine and Tom sort of allude to the importance of sort of jumping in and reacting. And in some ways, some of the lessons that we learned is we almost were there too quickly or wanted things to happen too fast. And I really appreciate, Shanee, your discussion of just about sort of the histories of power relationships and who owns and who controls one's cultural heritage and memory. And that also was a real driving factor in a lot of the project design for this Hurricane Memory Bank, which happened, it happened, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita just devastated a Gulf Coast, an area that most people who live there feel like no one cares about them anyway. It was a natural disaster, but it was a humanitarian disaster. It was failures of infrastructure. It made visible structures of inequality in such real visceral ways. And so we also, through partnerships and those of us who are on the ground, really, we knew that we needed to get a hold of and make different levels of sort of permissions and contributions possible. So just sort of one of those ways that any contributor could submit something, they owned that. We didn't own it. An institution didn't own it. We would preserve it for them if they agreed to give it to us. They got a copy of whatever they submitted. And they also could decide to submit something anonymously, so that on the public facing part, no one knew who that was. Or they could submit something and have it be part of this sort of research, a gated, not monetarily gated, but user permission gatedness. So that they wanted to submit something, but weren't ready for that to be made public. And so we tried to make those things possible through the contribution plugin through Omeka. But that really was our philosophy, or, our efforts were sort of built into those choices. There were some other things we did, Tom was mentioning about how it's sort of like on this edge of Web 2.0. Well, open tagging was kind of a big thing in 2005. It's sort of hard to believe that then, but we had a big debate over whether or not to allow other people to tag contributions. And we decided not to, that was again part of building trust. And we didn't want anyone feeling like whatever it was that they decided to share could then be miscategorized by someone else. So only they had that power to describe and do it as they wished through both, written description or just a quick tag. So those were some of the ways that we did. We tried to address that, and also even though our grant, had to focus on electronic collecting online, we knew there was such a big challenge with connectivity, as Catherine's talking about now. I mean, there were displaced people, there were folks who were moving around. So we actually created, postage postcards that were, paid for, pre-stamped, prepaid postage stamps, and left them in libraries, in coffee houses, and distributed them through the community, through there were little markets, open air markets and things like that, through Mardi Gras celebrations, which was when one of our big launch events were. We also created a Skype phone number. So people might have a phone, and yes, they might be able to get the internet maybe, but they can make a phone call. And so we set up this Skype voicemail, and Michael Mizell Nelson happened to had a connection with someone who knew the Marsalis family, and Delfeo Marsalis, who's a trombone player, one of the jazz musicians of this famous, well-known family, recorded the voicemail message. So that again sort of gave it a little more just grounding that this project, you could trust it. It was a legitimate project, it would be okay. So those were just a couple of strategies that we used through outreach and design.
Yeah, so all of this conversation about these careful relationships with contributors and communities and building trust and all of those things, I would say from the Omeka point of view, at just about the time when, Shanee, when you're working on the Antioch project, there were a number of Omeka collecting sites launched in response to police violence. And so there was the archivist-driven site about police violence in Cleveland. There was a collecting site around the incident, the situation in Ferguson with Michael Brown, and then there was the Baltimore uprising site in response to the Freddie Gray murder, and a whole bunch of those. And the response to the Omeka team from the community-driven collections from that work was that the collecting facility that allowed people to be anonymous on the public side was interesting, but not safe enough for these communities who were really scared about police surveillance and really very much wanted the opportunity to contribute fully anonymously, so that the collecting institution would not have a way to be forced to turn over information about their contributors. And so, in the realm of how can we, as people who make software and build things to facilitate public history and those sorts of things, what kinds of ways can we be responsive? That turned out to be like a pretty easy thing that we could build into the collecting interface. So it raises all sorts of other questions, though, for researchers and for archivists. And we're like, what do we do with this thing that we don't totally know where it came from, that we can't follow up, and all of those sorts of things? And so weighing these really difficult concerns about people's safety and trust and an investment in the project at the same time as weighing sort of the long-term implications for the research value of the material. And, you know, that continues to be an open question, but we're certainly pleased that we were able to make that alteration and share it with the project so that that is a possibility now. I feel like we've had a lot of conversation about these community curation and stewardship questions. I do sort of wonder, we have a sort of a larger question about digital collections that are live on the web in the age of algorithmic surveillance and machine learning and all of those sorts of things. And so we do sort of want to have a conversation about how you feel about the uses to which your collected materials might be put. Sheila, I've got you on the hook for starting that conversation.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Yes, so we are at that question. No, that's okay. That's okay. I mean,
I'm trying to be mindful of the clock, so.
Of course, no, I appreciate that. Having the ability to revisit these what we've kind of called raw collections, I think is a really important piece, and something that we at HGMB didn't necessarily have as much of that time as I would have wished we did. Again, that's sort of we jumped in very quickly and collected a lot of stuff, and then didn't have nearly as much time sort of later on in assessing really all of it. You know, we had a lot of uncaptioned photos. We had a lot of, but photos are a really important way to sort of document destruction and document neighborhoods. And so we didn't want to take those away. But we did have a collection of hundreds of documents that someone contributed, and it was from volunteers and some first responders. And we got, you know, as I said, like hundreds of PDFs on DVDs that we had assigned permissions, donation form, you know, that they had permission to share this, that there was no personally identifying information. And we had PDFs that were not OCR'd. So they weren't scanned. We didn't have transcriptions. Well, it turned out someone, 5 years later, maybe a little longer than that, maybe it was about 5 years later, was Googling themselves, right? This process of how much of my information is out there on the web. And they found their name, and then through that process started opening some of the documents that were in this collection and found that their social security number was on some of these things. Well, we didn't know because we had processed at the collection level. We didn't have the number of people to go through every single file at that item level. And so we were contacted, and it was like, okay, we got to stop everything and address this issue. And one of the things that we were able to do immediately was to make that collection private. So within, within the system, within the sort of pre-Omeka project, we could make the collection private and make sure that all of those items that were in that collection were private. So that then we at least could stop whatever leakage there was, or exposure. And what we realized is that if that wasn't necessarily scrapable in the way that perhaps it might be now, but it still was a huge problem, and we didn't want that problem to be the case. So we actually never put that collection back up to be public because we just didn't feel like it was worth it. So I think that, so that's certainly an example that I can share that's not about, certainly not raised to the same level of, facing possible arrest or surveillance in that sense, but in terms of personal data, that was something we certainly never intended, and then ended up needing to react and did so in the best way that we thought possible.
Yeah, I think that example is an important one because it points to the kinds of uses these materials can be put to, sometimes many years after their first collected. And Dana Boyd makes the I think really important point that the salient feature of big data, right? Big data and artificial intelligence is not that it's big, right? It's not that you've collected a lot of material or you have a big collection of material. It's that it's networked, right? This stuff is on the web, right? And it is linked, whether you want it to be or not, through text strings, through other kinds of identifiers, through IP addresses, through MAC addresses, through all the kinds of traces that digital information carries. It's networked to other information, right? Other information that you might, you as the contributor of that might not realize that, like, somehow this contribution you made to the Hurricane Digital Memory Bank can be linked to your Amazon purchases, right? That's how we all end up with those creepily relevant ads on our Google searches and stuff, right? And I think it's increasingly incumbent upon us, as Sharon's example and Sheila's example shows, to take that into account when we mount these collections, because it's really impossible for us to know in the moment what kinds of uses it's going to be put to later on.
Yeah, absolutely. Shanee, has your collection been in the world long enough to have someone come back and say, I don't know about this, and maybe I want to pull that back?
Not that I've seen thus far, but I do want to raise up some of the work that the archives profession has done around providing resources and thinking through our approaches and protocols for representing archival materials of the LGBTQ community, for Indigenous materials. There's work around description and the ethics and politics of sharing now versus sharing later, redacting information. Two of those resources I'd like to share. One is the Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia Anti-Racist Description Resource, and
which is spectacular.
Yes. And if you just search Archives for Black Lives, you can find that. And also another project called Project STAND, and STAND stands for Student Activism Now Documented, and they include an entire toolkit for redacting content and what it means to keep people safe while curating collections.
That's great. They just got a big pile of funding.
Yes, from Mellon.
From the Mellon Foundation. So that's great. Catherine, are you guys having conversations about sort of trying to future-proof some of this?
Yeah, constantly. And again, as someone who's used to, like, my subjects honestly being dead, and in the past, I was completely unnerved by this. I mean, completely unnerved by this, and have sat in on many of these conversations. And so, right, everything from teachers got interested in the archive pretty quickly and wanted to give and have given their classes wonderful assignments to contribute. But then you have children that are contributing to an archive, which is its own set of questions and its own set of permissions. People participated in Black Lives Matters protests over the summer, and they were wearing their quarantine masks or their COVID masks, and they uploaded these pictures. And then there was the question, I mean, at least here in Phoenix, and I'm sure other places, like, there were literally drones over these protests. So people were very conscious of the surveillance nature, and, well, should we include these photographs? And we decided in the end just to include either very broad gauge ones or extremely narrow ones where only the person that, submitted the photo and had given consent was there. Then there's the whole issue that all of this is about health, right? Like, this is about people's health. And so we realized, at a certain point, if someone said, I'm uploading this experience of me worrying about my friend, fine. But if someone says, I'm uploading this experience of me worrying about my Uncle Bob, and their contribution was not anonymous, they were essentially outing Uncle Bob as having had COVID, right? And Uncle Bob had not consented to this. So all of this then just required constant recalibration of what we were asking for, of talking to partners, right? And again, my colleagues are doing this work. Now, you know, when you collect these oral histories, could you please flag these things for us, right? And honestly, to this moment, right, things still occur to us, or new sort of perils happen. And the inclination is clearly always to err on the side of protection, right? To make something private, to take something down, rather than taking any risk that someone will be exposed in a way that they have not consented to, or that could harm them. But oh my goodness, hats off to you people for dealing with this all the time, because it is so fraught with peril.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. So we've got slim moments left. And our final question for the day is sort of a kind of lightning round about what you think the future of this approach to collaborative collection building and public history might be. And I'm just going to go counterclockwise and circle around my screen of tiles here. And that means we're going to start with Shanee. I hate to do that to you, but I'm gonna make you go first.
I'm ready to go.
Okay.
Since the Antioch project started, long-term sustainability has been a concern, and everyone who's been working on that project is now at another institution. So thinking about, you know, building collaborative models that include succession planning and financial support for the ongoing support of that work is really important, including thinking about our re-granting protocols. Some of these projects are supported by grants that are term and don't include, you know, ongoing commitment to the internal professional development of these folks to continue to do the work. And even, you know, now as we see during COVID, keeping some of these smaller community-based institutions open. So funding is really what I'm working on now here at BPLA.
Always and forever. Thank you for that. Sheila, you're next in line.
My goodness, I have many things to say, so perhaps I will limit. I do think that even just moving forward, we're seeing more and more of projects starting with things like charters and ways of engaging in preservation, so that ethics kind of lead in design. You know, whether it's documenting the now project that so strongly does that, offers models, and even not other models of digital projects that through transcription are uncovering voices and people, such as Colored Conventions project. They just have these strong sort of charters, and I feel like something that sounds small like that can be really important to influencing every sort of decision along the way. And that very much builds upon what Shanee was talking about in terms of the sustainability and the succession plans. One other nugget I want to throw out there is that I do want us to be able, at a sort of a researcher access level, perhaps not widely available on the web, but for there to be some way to encourage some computational analysis with these collections that have been collected digitally, so that we can use that scale. If there are cases when we have collected at scale, to actually be able to use those resources in a way that does make some sense, that can help us draw some conclusions and ask more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, what do you think? What's next?
Yeah, my thinking on this has changed a lot over the 20 years. I think for the first 10 years, let's call it from 2001 to 2011, I thought this was the future, and that this was the future of historical collecting, and ultimately then in turn the future of historical research and primary source work. Then there was a time when I think, sort of the heyday of our love affair with social media, when I thought, oh, well, why would anybody do this anymore if Twitter and Facebook are collecting every single utterance anyone has ever made, all around the world? Those those records are going to be so much more valuable than any small collection that we can put together. And then in the last 10 years, as those and at that time, Twitter was going to donate its archive to the Library of Congress. There was a lot of talk about their kind of responsibility to maintain this record. I think over the last 10 years, we've seen that those platforms have become, cesspools, and also that those companies have abdicated any sense of responsibility to the greater good. And so now coming back around, I think these kinds of efforts have a lot of salience. Like, if we want a record of the digital experience of communities in the 21st century, we historians, we librarians, archivists, we're going to have to build it ourselves. And we're going to have to figure out ethical and responsible ways to do that.
Yeah, interesting. Catherine, as somebody who's doing the active collecting in the 21st century of all of us right now in the process of building a collection, what do you think is next?
I would give a very lay answer, which is that part of the value of these collections, I think, is in reaching out to people and giving them a broader sense of what historians generally do and what history is, so that in talking to people about contributing to Journal of the Plague Year, we're saying you're a part of history. 100 years from now, people are going to want to know about you, which is kind of civically meaningful, but it's also a way of saying, and history is not just about George Washington, right? It's not just about a few great people. History is the fabric of humanity. And so as a kind of outreach effort also for the profession, I think that this kind of work is enormously valuable.
Yeah, that's a great way to close. I would only say that as on behalf of the Omeka team, what is next for us is to continue as best we can to respond to the needs of the community of people building these projects, and to try and be responsive to the features and the kinds of things that you're looking for. So every day we're trying to strengthen the ways in which the platform connects to a larger ecosystem of digital preservation and those kinds of things, so that hopefully in 100 years, when historians want to know about the plague years, we'll be able to have adequately preserved those collections. So thank you all for this. It's been a really lovely conversation, and I've learned a lot about a lot of projects that I've admired for a long time, from people who I've learned from for a long time. And I hope that our viewers and listeners in the NCPH annual meeting crowd also will have learned from the conversation.